Hello, my name is Matthias de Scheerder and I'm Managing Partner and Integration Architect at Archers. If you want to know more about how you can raise API maturity in your organization, be sure to watch our video talk about the API maturity for the HelloView API Summit. In this talk, we will discuss the Archer step-by-step approach to start your API program and raise API maturity in your organization. We will talk about the 6 stages of API maturity and explain how you can accomplish your goals. My name is Matthias de Scheerder and I am Managing Partner at Archers. I'm an integration architect with a strong focus on API management and with interests in enterprise integration in general. Often an API initiative starts when the CIO says, "Okay people, let's start making APIs." He might have heard this from colleagues or other tech leaders, or he could be feeling the pressure from Gartner and Forrester reports indicating that you should be doing APIs. So when called to action, an architect's first idea might be to select and buy the best API platform and get on with it. So they start writing a big number of papers to write out requirements, start an RFP track, and do a platform selection. On the design and development side, people start writing design standards and guidelines, maybe influenced by authorities like Google or Zalando, or they start from a blank page and they create guidelines by themselves. But that's not enough. If you want to engage in a successful API journey, and especially if you want to end up with a mature API program, you need to do more. As a first step, you need to define your strategy. Having an API strategy is essential because it will help you set the right focus for your API journey. You will compose your program and make your decisions by reflecting on your API strategy. But what exactly is an API strategy and what does it contain? Basically, an API strategy answers some basic questions. What strategic objectives do you want to accomplish with APIs? What's important for your organization that APIs will help realize? And what is the added value APIs will bring in your organization? You are not just doing APIs because they are fancy, or at least you shouldn't be doing that. So once you have defined your strategic objectives, you will have an easier time putting your API journey together. They will not only help you to define the journey, but they will also help you convince your organization to adopt an API architecture. And lastly, they will also provide a measure to quantify and qualify whether your API initiative is a success. So how do you answer these questions? This will differ from organization to organization, but we have some advice to get you started. You can think about the triggers that got you thinking about APIs in the first place. You can think about both internal as well as external objectives. Your organization might or might not have both, but try to list them and see where APIs come in. Read around on the market, get informed, and see where you can find the value for your organization. And very important is to engage your stakeholders. Your stakeholders have opinions, they have requirements they want to see fulfilled, and generally they have some very valuable input for you. So pick their brains, capture those requirements, and use them for your API strategy. And specify the added value APIs will bring into your architecture and your IT landscape. And communicate this strategy as well. The more you communicate it towards more people in your organization, the more feedback you will get on this on one hand, and this can help you adapt and strengthen your strategy, but also the more your organization will embrace it. In case you want to know more or get inspired, we have a webinar on the API economy that you can watch. Now, about drivers for an API journey, this will be different for each organization. Each organization will have their own reasons and their own drivers to start an API initiative. One organization might want to engage in a more flexible and meaningful ways with partners. Another organization might want to expose as much data as they can in order to partake in an open data initiative. And yet another organization might want to expose their valuable data and monetize this using APIs. At Archers, we have encountered a number of frequently returning drivers. They are listed here, and they can serve to inspire you and your organization to reflect on what is important for you. So once you have your strategy defined, it's time for the next step, starting up your API program. But how can you do this? So starting with API management is much more than just selecting a tool and writing guidelines. It's not just a technical initiative. It entails a number of aspects that all need to be taken into account in order to make your API journey a success. We have already covered the strategy, and the other aspects will be influenced, and often to a great extent, by this strategy. You will need to govern and manage the APIs throughout their lifecycle. This also means having them documented in a good manner, and all of this without being a bottleneck towards delivery. You will need to have a platform in place. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have a dedicated API gateway, but your APIs will be running somewhere and the right provisions and decisions will need to be taken. Some organizations will have a more complex platform architecture than others, and this will again be based on the needs and the requirements of your organization. You will need to think and possibly make changes to the organization. API management often means introducing some new roles, and which roles that will be will again depend on the organization and the goals that need to be accomplished. You will need to think about how to design and realize APIs. Often organizations introduce an API reference architecture, or they amend their existing reference architecture with API-specific extensions. And also very important are standards and guidelines. As an organization, you want to have consistent APIs that have the same look and feel, which means that they work in a way expected by your consumers. Having standards and guidelines will help your architects, your designers, developers, and testers to work in the same way across teams, tribes, or however your organization is arranged. And lastly, communication is important. You will need to train and coach architects, analysts, and developers. You will need to spread awareness of the initiative. You need to keep stakeholders in the loop, and all these things need to be taken up in the program as well. So at Archers, we have created a standard framework to construct an API program. We call these the 6 pillars of the API program. Depending on the organization and the demand at hand, we will use this framework to assess what needs to be done and what is already in place. We have also created a base framework for API governance. This shows the base flow in order to guide APIs through their lifecycle, which roles are implicated, what deliverables have to be created, and for which checkpoint. Note that we call this the base or standard framework for a reason. We can fine-tune this depending on the organization and its needs. Some organizations might have an issue with contract quality, for example, and so they might start with just a contract checkpoint. And then they can add other checkpoints when the need arises. Others might start with the full framework and relax it when the initiative is going well and maturity is rising. So it's a modular and flexible framework. We can also help you take a quick start with standards and guidelines. We have base standards ready on different topics regarding API design. For example, how to version your APIs, what HTTP status codes you will be using, or how to implement filtering and sorting in your APIs. We also have base standards for security topics. For example, how to implement authentication and authorization and what the difference is, how to keep your information safe, and what to handle in the different layers of the security architecture. It's important to highlight again that your API program will be driven by your API strategy. The strategy will define the scope of the initiative, and through setting the objectives, it will also determine the level of ambition for your initiative. In that sense, you will see that an API program for exposing external APIs will be totally different than one for only exposing internal APIs. So, now we know what aspects come into play for constructing an API program. It's time to get a feel for what your current maturity state is, and this is the next step. So as explained previously, we have our program consisting of these 6 pillars, and they will help us to assess an organization's current maturity state. We consider it highly important to start with such an assessment. And the reason for that is that you probably aren't starting from a blank page. It's possible that projects or parts of the organization have already started creating APIs. Some organizations might already be engaged in service-oriented architectures or another kind of integration architecture. So it's important to not only assess your framework, but also your assets. Assets can be swaggers, can be architecture descriptions, can be API architecture and projects. And these can give you a pretty good idea on what is really happening in your organization. In order to collect information about these assets and collect some concrete examples to look into, you should talk to API architects, analysts, and developers. Based on the assessment you have just done, you can position your organization in the maturity model, which we will explain now. It's important to state that not all pillars are aligned with the same maturity state. For example, you might already have gained some maturity on the platform level, but you might be lacking in the governance area. So this is the maturity model that we have developed based on experience and insights we have gained through a number of API programs at various customers. There are 6 stages. They are portrayed in the columns. And per stage, there are various aspects pictured at row levels. These aspects contain objectives that you should reach in those stages, but also what needs to be accomplished for the 6 pillars that we have already mentioned. This maturity model allows you to position where you are now, where you want to go, and define what actions you need to take in order to get there. So we have defined 6 stages, and for each stage there are objectives that should be reached. The first stage is the organic stage. This is the point where you haven't really started an API initiative. Only a limited set of architects and developers have started creating some APIs, and often in an ad hoc way. There is no central steering, there's no governance. It's an organic growth of realized APIs and projects. In the initiating stage, the API initiative really starts. The purpose of this stage is to convince the future leads of the API initiative. You want to determine what you want to achieve with APIs and your architecture. You want to see whether you have to bring in new technologies, and you will be executing a proof of concept to show the future leads what needs to be done. The next stage is the exploratory stage. In this stage, you want to convince the future sponsors of the API initiative, so the focus will be to reach the business and IT sponsors. You will test the first version of the API framework with a number of pilot APIs, so you can make it tangible for sponsors what can be accomplished with APIs and an API platform. After you have convinced the future sponsors, the next stage is aimed at reaching a bigger part of the organization, and this is the emerging stage. In this stage, it's important that you select a number of believer projects or teams and get them on board. It's easier to convince architects, project managers, or developers if they already believe in APIs and API platforms. This will allow you to have successes on a much larger scale than in the previous stage where you are limited to just a select few pilots. The next stage is a systematic stage. In this stage, you want to roll out your API management initiative over the entire organization. You will target all architects, all developers, all business projects. The optimized stage is the final stage. You want to have an API initiative where you continuously improve your organization and your framework. In the next step, you will define your target and your program. Now it's important to define the target stage you want to achieve. For example, the assessment might indicate you are now in the initiating phase and you want to go to the emerging phase. So you have to define the right actions to accomplish this. It's important to define your target state based on a few factors. You have to be realistic about it. First, the as-is assessment has indicated your current state. That's your first factor. Secondly, the time horizon is important. What is the time span you want to accomplish your goals in? Take into account that you cannot just jump up 2 stages in maturity in a time span of 2 months. You need to give it time. This also depends on the adoption rate of the organization. Sometimes organizations easily and quickly adapt, others will need more time. So, based on the model, you can define your actions, plan these, and you can start your API program. It's also important to respect your gate conditions. You cannot just skip stages without meeting gate conditions. For example, when you go from the exploratory to the emerging stage, it's important to have successfully ended your pilots, because then you have proven that your platform and your framework are installed and functional. Lastly, we need to mention that our maturity model is not a static model. It's possible that you reach a high level of maturity for a first strategic mission, but that you find you have to restart because you start up an entirely new mission for which you again have to gain maturity. For example, a first mission might be to focus on internal APIs and attain a high maturity level in doing so. After this, you want to start doing public APIs. Now, public APIs come with their own set of challenges and characteristics, and so you will start from a lower maturity model for this new mission. So this is very much an iterative model that will support you throughout the iterations you are taking. Now, in order to objectify the success you are having with APIs, you need to measure and steer. You cannot just launch your initiative and hope that it will end successfully. You have to measure what you're doing. Therefore, we often start with KPI reporting. We define metrics or KPIs, we report on these, and based on the gained insights, we will steer and make the needed adjustments. Based on your API strategy and ambitions, we can define these KPIs. We can provide some examples, but remember that it will depend on your strategy and the goals you want to achieve. For example, you can report on the actual and the target number of APIs. You can do this on domain level or capability level, and you can also do it on type of APIs. How many internal and how many public APIs do you have or are you aiming for? Another kind of KPI can be to measure how many mobile apps are connecting to your APIs if mobile is one of your strategic goals. You can also define a number of KPIs on organization level in order to measure its maturity as a whole. For example, based on trainings that have been followed, based on coaching that has been done, or based on a competence model. Now we have come to the last step in this step-by-step guide, and it goes without saying that communication is key to make your API journey a success. And you have to act accordingly. Do not make this a hollow phrase, but make sure to implement it well. You will have to be and keep in touch with your stakeholders. They were the ones you were turning to get input for the strategy. Now make sure that their requirements and wishes are taken into account and convey to them your following up on these and making them a reality. In order to do this, make communication plans so you have a guide for what to communicate when. Train your architects, your analysts, developers, and testers. And once they have started with full enthusiasm, help them take their first step by coaching them along the way. Start with communities for the different roles. For example, start a community of practice for API development, in which you will, together with them, discuss patterns, standards, guidelines, creating new ones, updating existing ones, and maybe also retire standards that are outdated. But do it together, because they will be the ones implementing it, so you need them to be on board. Feedback loops, like in the community of practices, but also with your stakeholders, with management, will be very important to strengthen the initiative and get the base of support you need. So that was the last step of the journey. To give you a recap at the end of this session, in order to define your API journey, you will need to take the following steps. First, you will need to define a strategy on which you can base your API program. You will need to start your API program, think it through, define it well, and get a flying start. Think about where you are positioned on the maturity model now, decide what your target maturity is, and define your program accordingly. Measure your progress, and if you are not reaching goals, take the necessary actions. And do not forget to communicate within the organization. This concludes our step-by-step path for your API journey. If you want to know more, you can head over to our website and read our blogs on the API program and the API maturity model.